Thank you so much, Mrs. Ashman, for this very friendly introduction. Well, yes, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to give a lecture that really pushes you to your limits and we should go beyond everything you're used to as a historian in terms of thematic and chronological framing, a lecture in which concepts, categories, casualties, causalities, and responsibilities diffuse to the point of a state of cognitive enemy. In short, if you really want to move out of your comfort zone as a speaker, then give a lecture on nature and German history in the 19th and 20th century. That is the task I have been given. And in view of the theoretical and practical impossibility of the task, it would be very obvious to look for excuses.
Yeah.
So I could say the phrase that basically gets you through everywhere as a professor, namely you have to take a differentiated view. And we would have pretty good reference for this. So Raymond Williams wrote in his much-quoted book, Keywords, that nature is perhaps the most complex word in the English language, and it's not really any different in German. So I am quite happy that I'm not the only one in this mission impossible. Annette Kehner and Jutta Novosad have already undertaken the same task for the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So in crime, it's always good to have a partner in crime. So this is one way of approaching this subject, complexity, diversity of topics, diversity of perspectives, and we do have some nice aspects here as well. But if you look at the relationship between man and nature in the 19th and 20th century, there is a basic trend behind all the events and developments that can hardly be overestimated. Everything is getting steadily bigger, more brutal, more uncontrollable, more consequential, right up to the ecological self-endangerment of mankind.
Yeah.
And I am by no means trying to feed the ultimate that pre-modern societies were by nature more prudent, more considerate, or more careful in their treatment of the natural environment. So some of these things mentioned by Ms. Kahnler goes in that direction, but if you look at the ecological footprint of regular citizen and then search for something comparable in the time before 1800, you will not find much comparable destructiveness. Modern technology, modern ways of allocating and processing resources, and the modern lifestyles amount to a qualitative difference. And we have more and more people who live out of these needs. At the beginning of my research period, around 1800, for the first time, we surpassed the threshold of 1 billion people on planet Earth. Now it's 8 billion people, and the trend is set to continue. Ecological ruthlessness is probably as old as humanity itself, but only the global industrial age has managed to ruin an entire planet through sheer greed. Most listeners will be aware that for some years now it has been the duty of every speaker on this subject to mention the term Anthropocene in their presentation. Anthropocene as the scientifically approved diagnosis that we have entered a new geological era in which human influence on planetary processes is on par with the forces of nature. So it should come as no surprise that a threshold in the middle of the 20th century has been established for the transition to the Anthropocene. As you might know, there's a certain spectrum of suggestions as to where this threshold really lies. Maybe the steam engine, or the use of fossil fuels, or agriculture and the sedentarization of humans. But the very idea of a threshold seems quite dubious to me. Such a dramatic event and tied to just a single date, this is something quite arbitrary, and at best it seems like a Hollywood skip gimmick, but not in the solid human sciences. So we should certainly not be confused that a commission of the International Union of Geological Sciences recently spoke out against the Anthropocene. This is a decision dating back to March 2024 and provoked a lot of commentary, including a lot of outrage, but ultimately it was about the wrong question being answered by the wrong people in a rather clumsy way. Ultimately, the decision said less about our times than about the inability or the unwillingness of geologists to take a stand on current issues. Whether this is a legitimate decision by a scientific discipline or a bit of a shame, well, that's a question that everyone has to answer for themselves. All I can say is that there still are a few historians doing the job and turning the bridge between the past and what it means for our present situation. For me, the question of whether we are living in the Anthropocene or not is far less interesting than the processes involved. And here, the research on our Earth system has worked out that in many planetary processes today, we're moving far beyond anything we're familiar with in terms of history and natural history. The diagrams in Stefan's much-cited essay, The Trajectory of the Anthropocene, speak for themselves. Of course, humanity did not wake up one morning and found themselves in the Anthropocene. Rather, to put it in hydraulic terms, it drifted slowly at first and then faster in this direction, successively accumulating many small and large impulses in an almost relentless maelstrom. And if you look at where the sheer brutality of this development becomes noticeable, then your gaze is quite often directed towards the 19th century. To paraphrase Jürgen Osterhammer, the transformation of the world in the 19th century was also the ecological transformation of man, who gradually turned into a kind of a macroparasite. Since 1800, natural spaces have been polluted, natural resources extracted, living beings eradicated or shipped to the other side of the world in completely new dimensions. And the question of the consequences was usually a faint afterthought, if it was asked at all. What happened after 1945 was, to a certain extent, just the full throttle mode of a development that had been in the offing for several generations. What was new was not so much basic attitudes, global effects for technologies, but the unrestrained way in which all of this was able to unfold. When I put it like this, however, I am immediately confronted with a basic problem that every environmental historian in the 19th and 20th century faces. What are the right words for a completely unprecedented and eminently destructive event in which one is also complicit as a 21st century human being? The monumentality of what has happened can easily leave you speechless. It doesn't take much imagination to picture how future generations will fill this vacuum. Sometimes I wonder how people will write the history of our time in 100 or 200 years' time, and what some of the obsessions of our time will look like with a distance of several generations. I'm not sure if people in 200 years will still be talking passionately about Donald Trump or maybe about the Brexit that has brought me back here to Germany from England, but I'm pretty sure that in 100 or 200 years, people will be talking about our ecological footprint simply because they will feel its consequences in a very immediate way. Humans are pretty good at repressing and forgetting. We as historians try the best to work against it, but the repressing and forgetting becomes very difficult when it comes to things like barren landscapes, sunken cities, and regions with life-threatening heat stress. And if you want to get an idea of the tone of this future story, then please read Eduardo Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America. A furious indictment of the treatment of a continent that has been plundered for 500 years. And this is not my summary, but this is the subtitle of the English translation of the work, a classic written by a journalist under the impression of the dependency theory from Uruguay. Students present are strongly advised that this is the kind of book you should never, ever take facts from that you have not thoroughly verified elsewhere. But it is a book that you should indeed read because of the tone, because this tone or the sound is something that you will hear many more times. It would now undoubtedly be The safest way to approach the rest of this lecture in a tone of concern. Who attends environmental conferences regularly knows that if you hit the right church congress note and tap into the latent sense of guilt of the modern consumer, you can get away with everything. However, many of those present, and certainly my commentator, know that low-risk tasks do not appeal to me, and there are also fundamental reservations about the historian in the guise of Torquemada. When it comes to environmental issues, the moral foundation of the historical judgment is usually the least of all problems. It seems to me that it would be more worthwhile for historians to focus on a different problem, the question of how this overwhelming history can be restored, or how can we restore human dimension to it? So let's take, for example, the famous Mauna Loa curve, the measurements of carbon dioxide concentrations on Hawaii since the late 50s. It shows, as you can see, if we disregard the oscillation because of the seasons, a steady increase. This is quite a revealing scientific finding that conveys something of the force and inertia of material flows in the Anthropocene. On the other hand, such a curve is an unparalleled historiographical imposition and obscenity. So all the things we discuss as busy workers in the vineyard of historical science suddenly seem irrelevant in the light of such a curve. The two oil price shocks of the 70s, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, globalization of the world economy, none of these apparently had any significant influence on the rise in the most important greenhouse gas. The same applies, of course, to the civil society environmental movement that began forming on a broad front in the 70s, not only in the Western countries, but globally, and has been calling for a vigorous climate policy since the 80s. We know only too well that the protest against relevant problems did not just begin around 1970. Opposition to the ecological price of the industrial age is as old as the industrial age itself. There was the nature worship of romanticism, fight against cruelty to animals, protection of birds and other creatures, the hygiene movement in the big cities, a growing number of nature reserves, and then also a systematic landscape planning and design. There was a multitude of insights, experts, and measures that no sensible chronicler could simply brush aside. But in the light of today's knowledge, it is also obvious how much this fell short of the destructive power of global capitalism. The famous verdict of Hermann Löns said that the nature conservation of the late German Empire was ultimately a Pritzel-crime can be extended in any desired thematic, geographical, and chronological direction. Löns wrote back then, and I quote, messing with nature works in bulk and nature conservation in detail. And after 100 years, one can only add not only nature conservation, not only in Germany, and this has not really improved since the times of Hermann Löns. This, in my view, is the great paradox of historiography in the shadow of the Anthropocene. It can hardly be doubted that humanity first drifted slowly and then faster into a new world, but there is no equivalent reaction from our contemporaries. Even the ecological criticism, which has become a perennial political issue in Western society since the 70s, can only be such a reaction to a very limited extent. We had criticism of growth, which had been publicly visible since the famous Club of Rome study of 1972, but a large part of the protest was more a compliment than a criticism of the new affluent society, an expression of the widespread desire for a better quality of life, which since the 70s has also demanded certain consideration for ecological challenges. Climate protests of recent years have made us aware of how irritating, even dismaying, the gap between the scientific findings and the apathy of the vast majority of our contemporaries still is today. Imagine that the Anthropocene has begun and nobody has noticed. The best that can be said at this point is that we have now documented the consequences of our modern activities with alarming precision. The growth of this knowledge was by no means an autonomous, quasi-automatic cognitive process. Researching, exploring, and clarifying the relevant questions was a highly controversial process that only led to the result you are familiar with, thanks to a critical transnational public and numerous scientists with an intact backbone. Even an issue as complex as the global climate could be investigated in a global knowledge network, and the number of uncertainties, which were almost impossible to grasp, dwindled to such an extent that only stubborn ignoramuses can now deny the reality of anthropogenic warming, one of the great success stories of modern science. In no other field, the ecological movement prevailed as comprehensively as in the field of knowledge. But this is also a stale victory that rather saddened than inspired people. It was fairly reminiscent of Tom Lehret's bitter bon mot about the Spanish Civil War. Sure, Franco had won the battles, but we had all the good songs.
Yeah, he was.
So, how do you get people back into an environmental story without immediately and inevitably presenting them in a state of social, moral, and practical inadequacy? It seems to me that an essential, indeed unavoidable step would be to scale back the knowledge claims of modern natural science a little. We know a hell of a lot about material flows, consequences of chemicals that never existed on our planet before, about organisms and much more, but that only does not define what an environmental problem is. The globalization of environmental history research has triggered a tremendously salutary shock, a productive uncertainty about what an environmental problem really is. An ecological process is classified as a problem, and then it always has a social, cultural, political, economic framing, and a great deal for what we in Germany generally accept as a self-evident framing betrays our deep roots in Western industrial modernity.
The thing that is all the.
It is no longer a dewy-eyed endeavor to criticize Eurocentric thinking. The word Eurocentric was something of a shibboleth of global history in its storm and drink phase a few years ago, but the consequences are still dramatic. Just take the use of coal for combustion. Was it a waste of fossil fuel reserves or a source of acid rain due to the sulfur burned and released in the process? Or was this combustion of coal a source of particulate matter, as we know it from the countless films about Victorian London, in which the smog reliably wafts through the scenery? Each of these views can be legitimized scientifically, and each has implications. If you were to go to the city in the global south with this multiple understanding of the problem, you'll realize that the problems of coal are just one of numerous examples of urban environmental problems that major Western cities have worked through step by step, sometimes even over generations, and now they are occurring simultaneously in the major cities of the global south. The consequences, of course, must be discussed politically, but if you present yourself with the self-assurance of the Western affluent citizen that climate change must, of course, take precedence over all other perspectives, then the debate is pre-programmed. By the end of this lecture, I would like to say it openly. Behind the fascination of so many historians and other humanities scholars with the Anthropocene lies a more fundamental problem, a naive belief in science that receives the results of scientific research as if it were a modern oracle. The Eurocentric nature of our view becoming stranded in the intellectual depth of relativism, to link the multitude of perspectives without losing sight of the monumentality of the basic material processes, to show how, in the course of global modernity, we have simultaneously become ever wiser about the consequences, but also ever more limited in our choice of reaction methods. All this is the task of an environmental history, which we need, if only because otherwise we will become hopelessly irrelevant as a historical science in the 21st century. In the style of self-promotion, I could now point out that there's already a great book out there with a beautiful title, The Vortex. But this would be very immodest, and you can see that I'm modest when taking up the task of this presentation. And it would suggest that we already have this story. The Vortex is a synthesis that does not just want to take stock, but above all, opens up horizons to try out a new history, a written history, not just as a theoretical outline. And I would be very pleased if more historians could embark on this path, and if we could then say in a few years' time, the Vortex was quite a nice start, but the really good things came afterwards. In this sense, you ain't seen nothing yet. Thank you very much.